Hello everyone and welcome to this new lecture. Today the topic is indirect speech. So what do we mean when we talk about indirect speech? So when we say indirect speech, we talk about a quotation reported by someone else. So for example, when we have to express a thought, we can express it with a direct quotation. So like directly reporting what someone is saying. Like in the first example, Mark said, "I do not like Latin." So these words come directly from Mark. If I want to report what Mark said, I have to say, Mark said that he does not like Latin. So I just have to add the conjunction that. This is indirect speech. So sometimes when we are talking about indirect speech, we also use expressions such as objective and subjective clause. Let's distinguish them. An objective clause is when the subordinate is the object of the main clause. So in the example, I say that you are intelligent. I say what? That you are intelligent. So it is clear that you being intelligent is the object of what I am saying. Conversely, a subjective clause is when the subordinate is the subject of the main clause. So in the example, it is said that you are intelligent. So you being intelligent is the subject of what it is said. So this distinction is actually not important for Latin, but be aware that it exists. So sometimes when you hear people talking about indirect speech, you might also hear these expressions such as objective and subjective clause. So keep in mind what they are, because it can happen that you hear about them. So let's see the differences between indirect speech in English and in Latin. Actually, they are many. So in English, we generally use the conjunction that after the verb that expresses the thought, and then in the subordinate clause, a verb in the indicative mood. Latin language, however, has no conjunctions to express the indirect speech, but uses a construction with the accusative and the infinitive. So in English, we would say, I think that you are intelligent. And so the indirect quotation is expressed by that. But in Latin, you say something like, I think you to be intelligent, which is totally ungrammatical in English, but that's what the Romans would say. However, indirect speech in Latin has some peculiar characteristics which makes it easy to recognize. So, indirect speech, the first feature is that indirect speech is generally introduced by verba dicendi, so verbs of saying, or verba sentiendi, verbs of thinking. So we can have I say that, which in Latin would be dico. I think that, which in Latin would be cogito, puto, credo. I know that, which in Latin would be scio or nosco. I claim that, adfirmo. Or you can also have, for example, I hope that, spero. So you have a wide range of verbs, but just remember that their meaning is related to verbs of saying and thinking. The second feature is that there is no conjunction that. And so how do you recognize it? You recognize it because the third feature is that the subject of the subordinate clause is always in accusative. Of course, everything related to the subject, so adjectives, participles, etc., is expressed in the accusative too. Another distinctive feature is that the verb is in the infinitive mood. So now everything sounds kind of theoretic, but you will be able to understand what I'm talking about when we reach the section of the examples. So as for the infinitive mood, we know, because we studied it in the previous class, that Latin has three tenses for the infinitive: present, perfect, and future. Each and every one of these tenses express a particular temporal relationship with the verb of the main clause. Let's see what they are. So this is a general rule that you really have to remember if you want to translate the indirect speech correctly in Latin. So a present infinitive represents an action that is simultaneous with the main verb. A perfect infinitive represents an action that is prior to the main verb, while a future infinitive represents an action that is subsequent to the main verb. So, in other words, the tense of the infinitive in the subordinate clause tells you how you have to translate it in English. Let's take some examples so that you understand it in a better way. So let's assume that the verb of the main clause is a primary sequence verb, and let's explore all the temporal possibilities. Let's take one with the present infinitive. Puto Caesarem validum esse. So we have our main verb, puto, we have the subject of the infinitive clause in the accusative, Caesarem, and we have our infinitive, esse, which is present in this case. So the translation would be, I think that Caesar, since we have a present infinitive, it means that the action of me thinking and the action of Caesar being strong happens at the same time. So I think that Caesar, now, in this moment, is strong. Let's take a perfect infinitive. Scio Caesarem pugnam vicisse. I know that Caesar, in the past, because we have a perfect infinitive, won the battle. So this means that the action of Caesar winning the battle takes place prior to me knowing that. Let's see an example with the future infinitive. Credo Caesarem in Galliam venturum esse. So I believe that Caesar, since we have a future infinitive, the action is subsequent. So I believe that Caesar in the future will go to Gaul. So this means that the action of Caesar going to Gaul is subsequent to me believing that. Let's take another set of examples with the verb of the main clause being in secondary sequence, so being some kind of past tense. And let's explore even here all the temporal possibilities. So let's take an example with the present infinitive. Sciebam ciceronem orationem bonam dicere. So we have our main verb, sciebam, which is secondary sequence because it's imperfect. We have the subject of the infinitive, ciceronem, and we have our present infinitive, dicere. So I knew that Cicero, in that moment, was delivering a good speech. So the present infinitive tells you that Cicero delivering a good speech and me knowing that happened at the same time. I knew that Cicero at that time was delivering a good speech. With the perfect infinitive, we know that the action took place prior. So let's take the example. Audivi Ciceronem Catilinam damnavisse. I heard that Cicero, in the past, because the perfect infinitive expresses a prior action, had condemned Catilina. So this means that the action of Cicero condemning Catilina takes place before I heard that. Let's take an example with the future infinitive. Speramam Hannibalem Alpes superaturum esse. So this means that the action of Hannibal surpassing the Alps takes place after me hoping that. So I was hoping that Hannibal in the future would pass the Alps. So recognizing the tense of the infinitive is very important because it tells you the temporal relationship between the verb of the main clause and the verb of the subordinate clause, and basically also tells you how you should translate that in English. Let's give some final remarks, and then basically the lecture will be over. So it can happen that the subject of the main clause and the subject of the indirect speech coincide. So in that case, when the subject of the main clause is the same of the subordinate clause, the Latin uses the particle se. So let's take an example. Caesar dixit se victurum esse Gallos. So Caesar said that he, so Caesar, would defeat the Gauls. So Caesar is the subject of both actions. A thing that I would like you to do is to give you some steps following which you will be able to easily translate an infinitive clause. So the first step is always to identify and translate the verb of the main clause. So the verb of the main clause introduces the direct speech, so that is the starting point of your translation. Second one, which is very important, and it's a very frequent mistake among students, because that is something that in Latin is absent, is to add the conjunction that. Because in Latin you don't have that, but in English you need it. Third step, you should find the subject of the subordinate clause, which is expressed in accusative, and so translate it. Fourth step, you should find the infinitive in the subordinate clause, parse it, and identify the tense. The tense is very important because after you know it, you should ask yourself what is the relationship between the infinitive and the verb of the main clause. So, based on the tense of the infinitive, you should ask yourself, did the action take place at the same time, prior or subsequent to the main clause? And based on this relationship, you reach the fifth step. So you translate the verb of the subordinate clause in English with a suitable tense. I will give you a practical example. Okay, this sentence is incredibly simple, but this method is useful even for complex sentences too. So let's start from the main verb that introduces the indirect speech, which is spero. So, I hope. We have a primary sequence verb, so let's keep it in mind. Then we have to add the conjunction that, which in Latin is absent. Then we have to go find the subject of the subordinate clause, which is going to be in accusative. In this case, the first element that comes to our eyes is te, so you. If you have multiple accusatives in the sentence, just remember that the first accusative is always the subject, because you know that Latin is a very clear language, so it tends to avoid ambiguities. So whatever accusative comes first, that is going to be the subject of your sentence. So I hope that you, and then we have to go to our infinitive. In this case, we have futurum esse, which is the future infinitive of sum. So we know that the action of you being king will happen afterwards, me hoping that. And so, in English, I will probably need the future. So I hope that you will be king. And this is how you translate this sentence. Okay, that is all I had to say for this lecture. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in class.